You probably believe they've completely moved on, don't you? Every day you glance at your phone, hoping something will finally appear. A message, a missed call, even the smallest sign that you still cross their mind. But nothing happens, and little by little your thoughts begin creating the most painful story imaginable. Maybe I never really mattered. Maybe losing me didn't affect them at all. But before you accept that conclusion, there's something much deeper you need to understand. Silence doesn't always mean someone has stopped caring. For an avoidant person, silence is often where feelings become louder instead of disappearing. While you're fighting the urge to reach out, they may be struggling with something entirely different. They may be facing your absence in a way they never expected, unable to manage the emotional distance the way they once could. Stay with me, because this changes the entire picture. You didn't choose no contact because your feelings vanished. You chose it because carrying the relationship alone became exhausting. You grew tired of feeling invisible, emotionally disconnected, and constantly questioning where you stood. Now one question keeps repeating inside your mind. Do they even realize I'm gone? The answer is often much more complicated than most people imagine. Many avoidant individuals notice the absence far more than they openly admit. The difference is not whether they notice, the difference is how they process it. When you become silent, you remove more than your physical presence. You also remove the emotional space they quietly relied on to retreat whenever closeness became overwhelming. From the outside, their silence may look like complete rejection. It may seem like undeniable proof that everything you shared meant very little. But inside, something entirely different may be happening. While you're searching for answers on your screen, they may be carrying reminders of you inside their own thoughts without even trying. Your presence didn't simply disappear. It changed from something they experienced beside them into something they now carry within them. Most people never realize that this shift can become far more difficult than they expected. They often begin remembering moments that never seemed important while they were happening. Not the biggest arguments, not the unforgettable conversations. Instead, the quiet memories quietly return. The evenings when you remained patient. The moments you listened without trying to fix everything. The times you offered warmth without placing demands on them. They remember how safe it felt when you accepted them without asking them to become someone else. They remember how calm you stayed when they expected conflict instead. They remember being understood in ways they may not have appreciated while you were still there. Those ordinary moments often leave the deepest emotional marks. What remains isn't simply the memory of another person. It's the emotional experience they connected with while they were around you. A feeling that was unfamiliar, a feeling they may never have fully understood while the relationship was still unfolding. Now that you're gone, they no longer have the same ability to escape it. This is where everything becomes confusing. Even if they miss you deeply, they may never show it. Expressing those emotions feels dangerous because vulnerability means exposing parts of themselves they've spent years protecting. It means risking disappointment. It means risking rejection. It means surrendering control. Instead of saying, "I miss you," they often carry those feelings privately. They think about you during quiet drives, before falling asleep, during ordinary moments when life finally slows down enough for emotions to catch up. In those silent spaces, you're no longer simply someone they created distance from. You've become a feeling they have to sit beside. And for someone who has always managed closeness by creating space, that experience can feel overwhelming. What happens next may surprise you. When you were physically present, they had ways of controlling emotional intensity. They could answer later. They could create temporary distance. They could quietly pull away whenever closeness started feeling overwhelming. But once you're truly gone, those strategies stop working the same way. They can't push away someone who isn't standing in front of them anymore. They can't adjust the emotional distance whenever uncomfortable feelings appear. Instead, they're left sitting alone with thoughts they no longer control. That creates an internal struggle. One part of them remembers your comfort, your patience, and the safety they experienced around you. Another part immediately tries to suppress those emotions because feeling them becomes too intense. This is exactly why missing someone doesn't always lead to reaching out. Those two experiences aren't automatically connected for someone who fears emotional vulnerability. Contacting you would make those hidden feelings real. It would mean admitting they still care. It would mean risking the possibility that things won't unfold the way they hope. For someone who has spent years protecting themselves through emotional distance, that single step can feel incredibly difficult. So they remain silent. They convince themselves that saying nothing feels easier than confronting everything happening inside. But remember this carefully. Silence doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes it simply means emotions are being processed privately, completely outside your view. That's one of the hardest realities to accept, because your understanding of love naturally focuses on actions. Love feels like communication. It feels like effort. It feels like reassurance, consistency, and showing up. You measure affection through behavior. Avoidant individuals often experience something very different. They can love deeply while struggling to express it. They can miss someone while remaining distant. They can think about someone constantly while never sending a single message. Not because the feelings don't exist, but because expressing those feelings feels far more frightening than holding them inside. For them, experiencing emotion and revealing emotion are two completely separate challenges. While you're questioning your value because of their silence, they may be carrying your absence in ways nobody around them can see. From the outside, everything appears normal. They continue with daily life. They smile. They spend time with other people. They laugh. They appear unaffected. Watching that can feel incredibly painful because you're sitting with unanswered questions while they seem to have moved forward without hesitation. But appearances rarely tell the whole story. Sometimes what looks like moving on is simply another way of avoiding painful emotions. Many avoidant people don't naturally process difficult feelings by exploring them deeply. Instead, they create distance from the emotions themselves. They stay busy. They fill every hour with responsibilities. They surround themselves with activity because movement feels safer than emotional stillness. Their full schedule isn't always proof they're completely okay. Sometimes it's protection. They scroll through endless content not because every moment entertains them, but because silence leaves room for feelings to return. They spend time around other people, not because those relationships replace what they had with you, but because surface conversations feel easier than facing deeper emotions alone. They keep moving because motion creates the comforting illusion of control. As long as something demands their attention, they don't have to sit with everything waiting beneath the surface. But eventually, distractions always come to an end. Conversations finish. The phone gets set aside. The room becomes quiet. The busy day finally slows down. And in those moments, your memory quietly returns. Not because they deliberately choose to think about you, but because the emotions they've been avoiding finally find space to rise again. Sometimes it happens through a familiar street, a favorite song, an ordinary habit, or a memory appearing without warning. They may not even understand why it happens. They simply feel something they can no longer ignore. Many believe staying busy will eventually erase painful emotions, but emotions rarely disappear simply because they're ignored. Avoiding a feeling doesn't make it vanish. It only delays the moment when it finally asks to be felt. Avoiding difficult emotions never makes them disappear. It only delays the moment when they finally have to be faced. Every time the distractions fade away, the same feelings quietly return. Little by little, they can become trapped in a repeating cycle. They stay busy and experience temporary relief. Then life becomes quiet, and suddenly the weight of everything they've been avoiding settles back in. So they search for another distraction, another activity, another reason to keep moving, so they don't have to sit with what your absence awakens inside them. Over time, the exhaustion they experience isn't only about missing you, it's also about constantly trying not to feel what losing the connection has stirred up. Stay with me, because this is where things become much more complicated. They may even begin connecting thoughts of you with emotional discomfort. Not because you caused them pain, but because your absence forced them to face emotions they had successfully avoided for a long time. Instead of moving toward those feelings with curiosity, their first instinct is often to build even stronger emotional walls. They create more distance. They stay busier. They distract themselves more intensely. They do everything possible to regain a sense of control. From your perspective, it may look like complete indifference. It may seem as though everything you shared meant very little, but from inside their emotional world, something very different may be happening. They're not always trying to erase you because you lacked importance. Sometimes they're trying to reduce the emotional impact because acknowledging it feels overwhelmingly vulnerable. They're trying to quiet something that affected them far more deeply than they expected. Most people never recognize that difference. But emotional suppression has limits. It works for a while, then slowly begins losing its strength. Every time those emotional defenses weaken, even briefly, reminders of you quietly return. They remember the connection, not because they're consciously thinking about you every minute, but because they never fully allowed themselves to understand what the relationship truly meant. The emotions remain unfinished. Questions stay unanswered. Feelings remain unresolved. And unresolved emotions rarely disappear on their own. They wait patiently beneath the surface until life eventually slows down enough for them to be noticed again. They may never send the message you've been hoping for. They may never ask how you've been. They may never offer the reassurance or explanation you've imagined hearing. But that doesn't automatically mean you've disappeared from their emotional world. There is an important difference between reaching out and quietly remaining aware of someone. A person can stay silent while still thinking about what they lost. They can maintain distance while privately carrying the emotional weight of your absence. For someone who fears vulnerability, staying quiet often feels much safer than directly facing complicated emotions. Instead of openly reconnecting, they sometimes choose a quieter path. They observe from a distance. They quietly notice what's happening in your life. They pay attention without making themselves emotionally visible. Maybe they occasionally look at your profile. Maybe they notice changes in your life without saying anything. Maybe they silently wonder how you've been. They don't always do it in obvious ways, but they often remain more aware than you realize. Beneath those quiet observations is a question they may never say aloud. Have they really moved on? Or is there still a chance? No contact creates something deeply uncomfortable for many avoidant people. It introduces uncertainty into a situation they once believed they understood. When you were always available, the pattern felt familiar. They knew where you stood. They assumed that if they needed distance for a while, you would probably still be there afterward. That predictability allowed them to feel emotionally safe. But once you stop reaching out, that certainty begins disappearing. Suddenly, they no longer know what you're thinking. They can't confidently predict your next move. Instead of relying on familiar patterns, they have to live with unanswered questions, and uncertainty can become one of the strongest emotional triggers for someone who protects themselves through distance and control. Rather than openly asking those questions, they often look for indirect answers instead. They quietly search for clues. They wonder whether you've moved forward, whether you're happier now, whether you still think about them, whether someone else has entered your life. Every small detail they notice begins shaping the story they create inside their own mind. If you appear peaceful, they may become confused. If you genuinely seem stronger, they may begin questioning the version of you they always expected would remain emotionally available. That shift quietly changes everything. You're no longer completely predictable. You're no longer someone they assume will always be waiting exactly where they left you. And people often become much more aware of something once it stops feeling permanently available. Stay with me, because this next part explains why that matters so much. Curiosity alone doesn't always lead someone to reconnect. Feeling something and acting on it are often two completely different struggles. When you were still part of their daily life, they could control the rhythm of the relationship. They could move closer whenever connection felt comfortable. They could pull away whenever emotions became too intense. They decided how much intimacy they were willing to experience at any given moment. But once you step away completely, that balance changes. They can no longer manage the relationship through distance, because your absence has already created the distance for them. Instead, they're left recognizing the place you quietly occupied in their everyday life. Sometimes that realization isn't dramatic. It doesn't always arrive through overwhelming sadness. More often it appears through ordinary routines, shared habits, familiar places, quiet moments where your presence used to exist without either of you thinking much about it. They begin noticing the role you played in making life feel emotionally familiar. That realization can become surprisingly uncomfortable because it challenges one of the strongest beliefs they've carried for years, the belief that they don't truly need anyone. Rather than immediately accepting those feelings, many instinctively resist them. They convince themselves the separation was necessary. They focus on everything that was difficult. They minimize the connection. They repeat explanations that help them regain emotional control. Not because those explanations always represent the complete truth, but because they feel safer than admitting how deeply someone reached them. Acknowledging the full depth of those feelings would require vulnerability. It would mean admitting that another person touched parts of them they couldn't fully protect. It would mean accepting that someone mattered enough to change them. For someone who has survived by maintaining emotional distance, that realization can feel incredibly frightening. So another story begins forming inside their mind. They tell themselves they're fine. They remind themselves they don't truly need the relationship. They try believing it wasn't as meaningful as it felt. Yet underneath that story, another reality quietly remains. The emotions don't disappear simply because they're ignored. They continue existing beneath the surface, creating an ongoing struggle between what they genuinely feel and what they allow themselves to admit. That inner conflict becomes exhausting because it never fully resolves. It only gets managed one day at a time. And here's another truth many people overlook. When you spent months reaching out, explaining yourself, trying to repair every misunderstanding, and carrying the emotional responsibility for both of you, they may never have fully realized your value. Not because you lacked anything important, but because your presence always felt guaranteed. Constant availability often creates comfort instead of urgency. It quietly reinforces the belief that the connection will remain there, regardless of how much distance they create. But everything begins changing the moment you stop chasing. When the messages stop, when the explanations end, when you stop trying to convince someone to face emotions they're unwilling to confront, the entire relationship dynamic quietly shifts. You become someone they can no longer automatically predict. You stop being constantly accessible and instead become someone whose absence has real weight. You move from being someone they expected to always remain available into someone they can no longer easily reach. And inside many avoidant people, that change creates something unexpected, a quiet respect. They may never openly admit it, they may never put it into words, but deep inside, they begin recognizing a strength they hadn't fully seen before. The strength of someone who finally chose themselves instead of endlessly chasing what refused to meet them halfway. Slowly, they begin noticing qualities they may have overlooked before. They start seeing your emotional discipline, your self-respect, your healthy boundaries, and your independence in a completely different light. These qualities leave a lasting impression because they represent stability rather than desperation. Your silence begins saying things that words never could. Without sending a single message, you're showing them that you refuse to lose yourself just to keep someone close. You're showing that your love was sincere, but your identity was never meant to depend on another person's attention. You're proving that you can walk away from something that hurts you while still caring deeply about it. You're showing that choosing yourself is not the same as giving up. And psychologically, that creates a different kind of attraction. People often recognize someone's value only after realizing that person is no longer standing still, waiting endlessly for their attention. Stay with me, because this next part matters more than most people realize. Even if they notice this shift, they may never openly admit it. They probably won't come to you saying, "I see you differently now," or "I finally understand your value." They may never give you the words you've been hoping to hear. The reason is simple. Admitting those things would also force them to face their own behavior. It would require them to acknowledge how their distance affected the relationship and how their choices created the emotional gap between you. That level of honesty can feel deeply uncomfortable for someone who already struggles with vulnerability. So instead, they often keep those realizations private. They quietly recognize that something has changed. They notice you are no longer reacting the same way. They can feel that you now stand in a different emotional place, but they keep those thoughts locked inside, because expressing them would mean lowering the emotional walls they've depended on for years. Every day, you continue protecting your peace instead of chasing the connection. You quietly rewrite a pattern they had grown used to. Before, the cycle looked familiar. They stepped back, and you moved closer. They became silent, and you filled every empty space with effort. They created distance, and you worked harder to repair what felt broken. Without realizing it, you were carrying the emotional weight for both of you. But now the pattern has been interrupted. The familiar routine no longer exists. What replaces it is uncertainty. They aren't always sitting around waiting passively. Often they're watching to see what happens next. They wonder if you'll eventually return to the old version of yourself. They wonder if you'll break the silence first. They wonder whether this change is temporary, or whether something inside you has genuinely transformed. Because if you come back too quickly, everything feels familiar again. They don't have to examine themselves. They don't have to confront difficult emotions. They don't have to grow, because the relationship slips back into the version where they always felt safest. So they remain where they are. They stay quiet, not always because they feel nothing, but because they're trying to understand whether your absence is simply another phase or a permanent shift. If you return immediately, they can convince themselves nothing has really changed. But if you stay consistent, they're forced to face something much harder. The realization that the relationship they once controlled may never return to its old pattern. This time, they cannot predict what happens next. They are no longer dealing with someone they completely understand. They're facing someone who has become emotionally stronger, less predictable, and no longer willing to revolve around their comfort alone. That shift places them somewhere they've often spent years avoiding. It turns their attention inward. When you don't return to the old cycle, questions begin appearing that are much harder to ignore. Why did things end up here? What role did they play in creating this distance? Which emotions have they spent years avoiding? What was truly lost because they never fully allowed themselves to show up? These aren't easy questions, and they require a level of honesty that many people find uncomfortable. Sometimes they simply wait, hoping the pressure fades away on its own. They hope you'll return and restore what once felt familiar, because familiar patterns often feel safer than personal change. Meanwhile, something much more important begins happening, not inside their world, but inside yours. Day by day, you're reclaiming parts of yourself that slowly disappeared while trying to understand someone else's behavior. You spent so much time analyzing their silence, explaining their distance, searching for reasons to keep believing, and trying to make sense of a relationship that rarely gave you the same security you offered so freely. But this journey was never only about understanding them. It was also about rediscovering yourself. It was about recognizing how often you ignored your own needs just to keep hope alive. It was about remembering every moment you questioned your own worth, instead of questioning whether the relationship itself was healthy. It was about seeing how many times you lowered your standards, silenced your feelings, and accepted uncertainty because losing them seemed more frightening than slowly losing yourself. Now, within this silence, something meaningful begins taking shape. Not necessarily because they've changed, but because you have. Your perspective becomes clearer. You begin understanding that love was never meant to feel like endless confusion. It was never meant to leave you constantly waiting, second-guessing, or wondering whether you were enough. A healthy connection should never require you to repeatedly prove your value or fight for simple emotional presence. Once that realization settles inside you, everything begins changing. You understand that no contact was never truly about making someone miss you or forcing them to recognize your absence. Its deeper purpose was always to bring you back home to yourself.